I want to talk about the history of the Pinan katas in relationship to Kushanku, the kata called Kushanku. And many people have heard the story that the Pinan katas are based on Kushanku, that the developer of the Pinan kata is a guy named Itosu, Anku Itosu, that he kind of took Kushanku and pulled out chunks of it and used that to formalize the Pinans, but that's not actually accurate. It's partly true. Here's the actual story. Around the turn of the century, well, it was actually right at the end of the 19th century, there had been a lot of militarization in Japan. The Sino-Japanese War began in 1905. The Russian-Japanese War was right around that same period. So there's a lot of conflict. Japan actually went through almost a generation of constant war that finally ended with the end of World War II. And it was right kind of moving up to that time when the Japanese were really building up their military. They were conscripting a lot of people, including a lot of Okinawans, into the Japanese military. But Okinawa is a relatively poor agricultural environment, and so the diet in Okinawa didn't have a lot of calories in it. So Okinawans, as a group of people, tended to be very slight. So whereas you think of getting some. When we think of military likes to draft Iowa farm boys, big and strong and well fed. But what they were getting from Okinawa was scrawny and not apparently terribly strong. And then there were these two guys who showed up with really good physiques, and the Japanese doctors were curious about this, and when they inquired why, they were told by these guys that they were practitioners of tode, of what we now today call karate. And so they began to inquire about this. This prompted the interest from the Japanese military on the practice of Okinawan martial arts. And from an Okinawan standpoint, this was the first time when something which was a part of Okinawan culture was being looked at as maybe a benefit or a plus. So it became very important for the sort of Okinawan spirit and the Okinawan people, because they were always sort of second-class Japanese citizens. The idea that they had something to offer, something that would make the Japanese appreciate Okinawa better, that was highly appealing. So there was this movement to sort of introduce karate to Japan, and that's where a lot of our experiences with karate have their origin, from that thing. The Okinawans had always trained it secretly, and now they wanted to kind of go public in order to get some recognition for their culture. So Itosu, this guy named Itosu, he was a student of Bushi Matsumura, and he decided to assemble a curriculum of karate. He consistently used the word tode when he talked about this. He wanted to assemble a tode curriculum that could be taught in the school system in Okinawa. There were 5 grades in the school system, so he wanted 5 kata, 1 for each grade. Now, in a highly traditional society like Japan and Okinawa, you don't just get to decide to create something. There's this whole process of, you kind of have to be given permission. And so this is where it gets tricky. He wanted to do this, and so the idea of him just inventing a style or inventing kata, that would be sort of like, you can't do that. Who gave you the right to do it? Who do you think you are? I mean, there would be a lot of social pressure against that. If you're going to step out creatively, you still have to do that within a very narrow confine of cultural concepts. And so what he did was, he started out by selecting a kata that already existed to be the first kata. This kata he picked came from his teacher, Bushi Matsumura. Now, we're not quite sure the origins of this kata exactly. It's known as Chanan. And Chanan is the name of a Chinese martial artist. That's the Okinawan pronunciation of the name of this Chinese martial artist. So the form supposedly goes back to this individual. Whether or not the form was actually developed by Chanan himself, or whether it was simply the one that he knew and that he taught when he was in Okinawa, or whether he taught maybe a set of self-defense techniques and then it was someone else, like maybe Bushi Matsumura himself, who assembled it into Chanan, that's uncertain. So we don't really know the origin of that form, but that's the form. He picked that form. But he gave it a different name. He was intending to call his set of forms Pinan, which means peaceful. So he wanted to have these 5 forms to teach school children. He picks one called Chanan to go first. Now we know this is the case in part because Choki Motobu once saw Itosu's students practicing Pinan, and he said, "Oh, that's Chanan." And they said, "Yeah, but we call it Pinan." So there it is. Now, the next thing that happens, now you have to understand, this is all about these cultural ideas of seniors and juniors and having permission to create. Itosu has to go to his senior. His senior is a guy named Nabe Matsumura, who was, I think, Bushi Matsumura's grandson. So Nabe Matsumura, as senior, has certain obligations towards his junior, even though there's no indication that, from a technical perspective, Nabe was a superior martial artist or something like that. But these hierarchies are very important. Both Nabe and Itosu were highly regarded practitioners, but there's still that social hierarchy. So Itosu goes to Nabe, explains what it is he wants to accomplish, and basically says, so the first one's going to be this one. I need 4 more. Can you make 4 more for me? Which, of course, Nabe, who wants to do that? But Nabe has an obligation as the senior, so he does what, as the senior, he's required to do. He comes up with 1. That's Pinan number 2. Pinan number 2 is the one that's so different from the rest that it stands out. Pinan number 2 is the one that, in almost every style, gets transposed with Pinan number 1, so it's taught first. And it's the one that kind of forms the basis for almost every H pattern form that you've ever seen. Whatever an H pattern form is, it's kind of influenced by Pinan number 1, which means Nabe Matsumura actually developed the template, which became the template for basic forms from then on, whether it's the Taikyokus or the Kata or the H pattern forms that are done in certain branches of Goju-ryu. They all just kind of follow that same basic pattern that was laid out by Nabe Matsumura. Now, once he'd done this, he gives this kata to Itosu. He says, "Here you are. Now you go figure out the rest." So he literally gives permission now for Itosu to finish the task. So Itosu then develops the last 3. The kata called Pinan 3 definitely includes some influence directly from Kushanku. And the kata Pinan 4 has clear influences from Kushanku. So to say that Kushanku is the basis for Pinan, it's definitely a basis for Pinan 3 and Pinan 4. However, Pinan 5 is not based on Kushanku at all. It's based on a kata called Basai, particularly Basai Dai. But it's based on Basai. And so what you really have here in the development of the Pinans is not as simple as he just based it on Kushanku, but rather something far more complex. A much older kata called Chanan, an original form developed by Nabe Matsumura, which we now call Pinan Nidan. 2 katas in the Pinan set, which do include significant influence directly from Kushanku kata, and then number 5 based on a whole other kata, based clearly on Basai. And so, this is how history is. It's never quite as simple. We love to make it simple. We like to be able to explain things in a sentence, but they never work that way. Even though I'm in the dojo, these are some reflections from the master class. I'm Chris Thomas. Thanks for watching. Now, go train. Oh, donuts. Hey, Rick.